Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. And with us we have Lisa Gill. Lisa is the author, or co-author, should I say, of this book, which we'll get into, Moose Heads on the Table. What an awesome title. And the host of the Leaderphormosis podcast. Lisa, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. So, Moose Heads on the Table, stories about self-managing organizations from Sweden. Now, there may be people listening to this who aren't 100% clear on what we mean by self-managing. So maybe let's start there. What does that mean, and sort of work out from there?
Yeah, well, a definition that I really like was written by Mike Lee, who I know you've had on your podcast as well, and Amy Edmondson, which is self-managing organizations are organizations that have completely decentralized authority across the whole organization. So it's not, to me, it's not just self-managing teams, although I work with those as well, but a self-managing organization is one where all authority has been decentralized. There's no one person who can override or make a decision about anyone else's work or job.
And why on earth would anybody want to organize an organization like that?
I think I know that my co-author Karin, when she first started talking about these ideas, she said she used to be met with either laughter, like this is outrageous and ridiculous, or anger, like what the hell are you talking about, or just complete skepticism. Whereas nowadays, it seems like even just in the last couple of years, there's a real increase in appetite for these ideas where it's not really radical anymore. A lot of people are recognizing that, it makes sense to have, teams that have greater autonomy in terms of decision making, because this kind of pyramid or hierarchical bureaucratic structure is slow, especially in the pandemic and things like that. It's just much more agile and responsive to have decentralized teams and to push the decision-making authority to the front lines of the action where all of that's happening. So, countless benefits that I'm sure maybe we'll talk about as the conversation goes on. But for me also, benefits are human. That's what I'm really interested in terms of development and in terms of learning and growing together and bringing our whole selves to work, which means a win-win for everyone, because if I'm bringing more of myself, then I'm bringing more of my talents, more of my intuitions that will benefit the organization. So for me, it's kind of a no-brainer, but I recognize that it's not for everyone and it can feel quite far away for a lot of people. So I think there's a spectrum, and I'm interested in what are some of the different moves that you could take along the spectrum?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that makes sense. I suppose what resonates to me there is bringing your whole self to work. I've had a history of working in large organizations, and that's something I guess I always yearn for. And I can see how this type of environment allows more for that. And then agility, which of course is the buzzword right now. But of course, if people are more autonomous within their team or their division, they're able to flexibly orient themselves to the market more easily, right? Is that way of looking at it?
Yeah, definitely.
And so how did you get interested in this? What brought you to self-management?
Yeah, well, I think I ended up in it by accident. Originally, I studied drama way back at university, and I worked in a number of different industries for many years. I kind of gave up on acting pretty fast. I was not very good at auditions. But I think looking back and connecting the dots backwards, I've always been interested in people and seeing the potential in people and what the conditions are that bring out the best in people. And back in about 2010-11, I ended up in a learning and development organization and quickly started to become familiarized with more radical ideas and became very interested in that. And then I set up my own company. And then I met my co-author, Karin, in January 2016. And we just hit it off straight away. And she told me about these stories, these organizations she'd helped transform going right back to the 90s, which was amazing to me because I had just read Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. And I was sort of really excited about that. And this feels new and exciting.
And
here
what's that book for people who've not heard of that book, maybe?
Yeah. I think to me, it's sort of, I think for a lot of people on my podcast, just about everyone I've had on the podcast mentions it or has been inspired by it, perhaps in the same way that many people have been inspired by Ricardo Semler back in the sort of 80s, 90s. So maybe Frederick Laloux is almost like the self-management or the new ways of working pioneer of our generation. But he talks about bringing your whole self to work. And the other two components of what he calls teal organizations being self-management and evolutionary purpose. So I think a lot of people resonate with that book of his because it was very soulful in a way that previous business books haven't been.
Especially from an ex-McKinsey consultant, right?
Well, yeah, quite. So many people I've met on this journey that I now collaborate with, that was the original piece that connected us, the shared love of that book and the desire to try and make those ideas a reality.
Right. So you found that book, you found Karin, and then what? You started to get involved with helping organizations make this transition or make the moves, as you said earlier?
Yeah. I mean, that had been my intention when I set up my own company in 2015, but I didn't know quite how to do it. And it was through meeting people like Karin and others that I started to learn. So Karin's training company, Tough Leadership Training, I then started to become one of the trainers with them because their approach to self-management and new ways of leading really resonated with me. And I met some other collaborators that I still work with today. And we really just started learning by practicing new ways of working and being together ourselves, and doing a lot of reading and having a lot of conversations and then supporting others to do the same. So nowadays, almost all of my work is supporting people in teams and organizations that want to work in this way, or they are already on their journey to working this way and they just want a little bit of coaching and support. So it was, I think so much of it is about the humans, right, that you meet and the people that you learn from and with at the right time.
Right. And so how was it going into Tough? I mean, how tough was it, Lisa? What was painful about that, if anything, moving to that kind of self-managing, and what did you love about it as you started to experience that type of culture?
Yeah, I mean, when I met Karin, she invited me and a few other of our peers to do the Tough Leadership Training. The sort of flagship course is called Step 1. It's a 4-day training. It's pretty intensive, and it's called Tough because it's tough. It's really tough to unlearn habits and ways of leading, ways of being. And I haven't really been a manager much in my life, but I had been a coach, and so I went into it thinking, I know how to be empowering. I know how to be coaching. I'll be great at this. And realized, I have so many, as we all do, pitfalls and learned behaviors and things where we do too much, really, I think, where we want to give advice, we want to help, we want to steer. And it takes a lot to unlearn that and then to learn new ways of being that really help other people to draw on their own capacity and potential. Mm-hmm. So that course was my first interaction with Tough Leadership Training. And then Karin and I started talking about writing this book together. And in the process of that, started talking about, well, what if I became a tough trainer? Would I be interested in that? And that became a several years long process of kind of being immersed in that world. And it's tough to be a tough trainer too. It's a lot of development work. And it's really like getting a magnifying glass and looking at how we are being. So that was something that we really wanted to capture in the book, is that this is an approach to self-management or new ways of working that's not about structures and processes, but it's about our mindset and our way of being and how we relate to each other and how that profoundly affects how other people show up around us or not. So that to me was always really interesting. And I think something that Tough does that's very unique still. So yeah, that's been a really good process. And I think people who go on the training experience a similar version of that.
Right. Yes, and that's something that I suppose is different, for people who've got some familiarity with this topic, and maybe they've heard of holacracy, and maybe they've heard of Zappos, and they've heard of these, flat organizations, Valve, and this book really doesn't mention structure or process at all, right? It's just a bunch of stories about people's experiences in giving away power. I mean, I suppose that's how I might sum it up. And it's about a way of being. It's about a way of being as a leader, and how some leaders are able to make this transition and others are not. And the sort of the structure that emerges sort of is downstream, right? It seems to me, from that shift in being.
Yeah, and I think in that sense, it's kind of, you could say, organizational operating system agnostic.
There's a phrase.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful. So I think, I hope that people could read this book or learn this methodology or some of these principles. And then on top of that, whether you choose to be, completely self-managing, or whether you choose to implement holacracy or Agile or any other of these sort of apps, you could say, I think this foundation of, how are we being, and what's our mindset, what's the paradigm from which we're operating, and sort of looking at that first. And then I think, you can put on top of that whatever sort of structures and processes that you want, whether you import those or whether you then create those together. But I think the premise of the book and this approach is that once you create the right climate, the right conditions, on top of that, you can do a lot of things that if you don't do that work first, sometimes you'll bump up against these obstacles where you realize we're actually trying to, install a new app, if I want to continue that analogy, but the operating system's outdated, and so it's going to have bugs, and it's not going to work, and it's going to be slow, and
Right, I get it. Yeah. So I'm interested then for you. So you did this step one, right? The course, and you already had a coaching mindset. You'd already been swimming in some of these ideas for a while, and there may be other people listening thinking, okay, I'm there or thereabouts. But what specifically could you kind of illustrate came up for you in that training that you were confronted with in terms of your own being and the transition you had to make?
Yeah, well, I think it's in terms of most people, when they do the training, especially nowadays, have a sense that when we do the kind of the introduction and the pitch of like, this is a new way of working and here's what it's like, everyone's kind of nodding like, yeah, we get this. I've read this in Harvard Business Review. I think I'm pretty coaching. I'm pretty empowering. I think I'm a pretty good leader. And it's really only when you start to practice typical conversations and have this lens of, we refer to it as like the difference between a parent-child dynamic and an adult-to-adult dynamic. And once you start looking at things through that lens at quite a detailed level under the surface, then you start to see habits and behaviors and ways of being that are in the way for that. So with me, I had brief experiences of being a manager, like a project manager, and I had also trained as a coach. I'd done NLP training, and I was a master practitioner, and I'd done some coach training. So I thought I was pretty self-aware and pretty adult in terms of how I lead or how I show up. But I was confronted with how much my version of being like a parent was being too nice, too cautious, too fluffy. So I'd say a lot of things, and I would tiptoe around people, and I would try and be really nice and add a lot of stuff. I was doing a lot of work to take care of other people. And the feedback I got was that this was actually disempowering, that this was, and it sends a message to people that I don't quite think you're up for this, or, I'm treating you like you're fragile, like you need a lot of help and sort of, nurturing and nudging along. Whereas actually, when you're really direct with someone, when you strip away all of that fluff and cotton wool, it telegraphs to people that I respect you, I relate to you as a capable, creative, intelligent adult, and I'm going to give you the headline, and I don't need to do all of that stuff because you can handle it, So I learned to do a lot less, was my kind of main takeaway, really. And that doing that was very liberating for me, because it meant
And what less in terms of the sort of caring and the couching of your message? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and also thinking that so many of us think a lot. When we're listening, we're really listening for what I'm going to say next, or, oh, I have a solution for this, or I have some advice that I can give, or what should I ask now? What should I say? And we're thinking a lot and doing a lot of work. And managers especially, I think the longer you've been a manager, the more you'll do this probably, where you've been promoted for being smart, for being a problem solver, for being responsible, for being analytical. And all of these things get in the way when you want to work in a more self-managing team, because it impedes other people drawing on their own initiative. So doing less we sometimes say in trainings to be lazy, like sit back, ask really lazy coaching questions. Like, yeah, what do you think you could do about that? Really simple. There's a great book actually called The Advice Trap. And he talks about all of these traps we fall into as managers, as coaches, as colleagues, where we think our advice is brilliant, and so often it's not. And what's really needed is just to listen and be with someone, be a sounding board, ask a few questions, and that person can get to something really useful much quicker than if I try and solve it and add my stuff into the equation.
Right. That's interesting. Yes. It reminds me of a friend of mine who runs a pub in the Midlands in England, and he works like half a day a week. I don't know how it's doing right now in the COVID, but I don't suppose he's ever read Frederick Laloux's book. But it would seem to me that he had a very much a self-managing pub, because he got to the point where, as the landlord, he did virtually nothing. And you might look at him and think, God, that guy's lazy, or he's got it easy, right? But he was certainly I know you talk in the book about holding space, but he was sort of, I suppose, creating a context for everybody who worked in that pub, that they could, manage their own work, and that they clearly didn't need him, certainly on a day-to-day basis, to run the pub. And so he's just sort of stepped away.
Yeah, there's so many examples like that, which is what I love when I come across an example of someone who just intuitively does this and has never heard the term self-management. Yeah. And some people do just have this way of being naturally, because they don't, for them, it would be crazy to do anything else, to micromanage, or, so sometimes you get these real black sheep that do this naturally. And other times there's a lot of unlearning and relearning to do, I think.
Right. And who so far has inspired you the most, or the company that's inspired you the most on your travels with this?
There's so many different examples, and it depends on a lot of different criteria, I guess. But I think I'm inspired by organizations that kind of integrate the two dimensions of structures and processes, and this like more human way of being mindset piece. And I think one example I like to talk about is well-being teams, which is in the kind of health and social care sector. And I think in that sector, this way of working is so needed, because organizations are having to do more with less and in really tough conditions. And you generally have people who are very capable and very passionate about their work. They want to deliver great person-centered care, for example, and it's often the bureaucracy that gets in the way of them doing that. And wellbeing teams, founded by an amazing woman called Helen Sanderson, to me is such a great example because they were inspired by Buurtzorg, which is an organization that, for those who have read Frederick Laloux's book, will be familiar with, but they're kind of the poster child, I think, of self-managing organizations. They're quite large. I think they're about 14,000 people at the moment, and self-managed teams of nurses that decide everything together in their team. And Wellbeing Teams is based in the UK, and they were inspired by Buurtzorg. But Helen and her colleagues also share what they're learning very transparently. So, for example, they do a lot of work around team agreements and how to make decisions together. And they also have come up with some really clever kind of workarounds for if you're regulated, that can often be tricky. How do you fit into external structures out there in the world, like regulators, when you're trying to organize in a radically different way? So they've invented these confirmation practices where instead of having a manager supervising and kind of micromanaging and checking everyone's doing the things they need to do to make sure that no one dies or is, neglected, they have a team-based, peer-to-peer based system of these confirmation statements that they review each week together. So they've developed some really clever practices, but they also very much embody this kind of compassionate, human, bringing your whole self to work piece. And they're constantly striving for ways to make that even more consistent and even more lived. So that's an example that I take a lot of inspiration from.
Right. And it's the marriage of the structures and the mindset that you think is working really well there.
Yeah, and I think they're a good example of an organization that draws on lots of different sources of inspiration. So they're very inspired by, Brené Brown's work about trust and shame and all of that kind of stuff, and the Ready in the US and their attention and practice cards, and all of these different processes and case studies and organizations, and then making them their own and developing their own way of doing it, because there's no one size fits all with this stuff. It's very much, I think you have to find your own way and your own path. And so I think they're a good example of that.
Right. And something you said in there resonated about the people being passionate about their work. Because there's a great example of failure, I think, in this story about the call center that Karin took on, right? Who you work with at Tough Training and the co-author of the book, where she came to the conclusion, this is my read on it, right? And you tell me what you think, but that it's no good empowering a bunch of people to self-manage an organization that they ultimately don't care about in a realm in which they're not passionate. And so you this doesn't really, so I think the more traditional types of management can work when people aren't passionate, right? Because you can wield the stick and you can push people along, and in certain contexts that can work and you can make a business from it. But when you're trying to hand over power when people aren't passionate about what they're doing, well, at least in this case, it failed. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think there are probably different approaches to this and perhaps people have found in other contexts that's not an issue. But in my experience, and I've heard this from many different people in their examples as well, often when you move towards a more self-managing structure, it makes things a lot more visible. So it becomes very clear who were the people who were really energized and putting in a lot of work, and who were the people who were sort of coasting and dragging their feet a little bit. And it starts to become clearer whose purpose is aligned with the companies and whose isn't. And I think that in the case of that call center and in other cases as well, self-management works best when people do care about the organization and the purpose. And I think Karin also found in some of those cases that competence matters, that if it's not your calling and you don't have, that's why Buurtzorg works, for example, because they have really high quality, competent nurses doing the work who are very skilled and highly professional at what they're doing. So it really it seems like that's really important. So if you're someone that just wants to do a 9 to 5 job and has a bit of like an employed mindset, and you just want to clock in and clock out, probably a self-managing organization is not going to be the place for you. And I don't think there's anything wrong in that. Everyone's different and people are often at different stages in their life. But I think self-management really works best when people are passionate about the work, when they're dedicated and committed to developing and growing and kind of strive for high quality in their work, and are prepared. There can be different levels, but are interested in how, working on the organization as well as in the organization to different degrees.
Yeah, no, that's right. But I suppose no amount of working on the organization is going to make a difference if ultimately people in the organization don't care, right?
Yeah, and I think if you compare that call center to Zappos, for example, Zappos has built its culture on highly customer centric people who really love their jobs. Those people love working in those roles. So that's a different example. And there were other kind of external factors as well, like the industry and the particular sector that call center was in, that ultimately meant that the company had to close down. But it's so inspiring that those people in that organization have gone on to do other things, and they came out having learned and grown and developed huge amounts and gone on to find work that they really did care about. So it kind of released them in a way from the shackles of this kind of dreary organization that they never really wanted to be part of in the first place.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And it does remind me of when I've worked with agile teams that, applying agile practice can have a similar effect. It kind of exposes the people who aren't really up for it, right? And it becomes much more transparent. So that's interesting. You discovered the same thing.
Yeah, and I think those transparent conversations are useful. I know that another organization, Busy, I think you've spoken to Tom Vanderlip
yes.
on the podcast, and he talks about how having conversations about purpose, that they've had situations where an employee in their organization has realized, actually, my purpose is this. I'm going to go and do this instead. That's where my heart is. And everyone's celebrating and said, that's great. You found your purpose and you're going to go and do that. And we love that. And we're happy for you. We'll miss you, but go and do that. And actually that person ended up coming back and returning and saying, no, actually, I do like it here. And this is my place. And I think actually Menlo, you've also spoken to Rich Sheridan, Menlo Innovations is the same. They have people that go and explore something else, and then they come back to Menlo because they realize that it is in line with their purpose and it is special there. And I think that's really a testament to the culture of those places, and important, because if it's not, I don't think we should try and convince people to stay in an organization. I think it's much better to have, again, these adult to adult conversations of, is this the right place for you? And if it's not, let's support you to find what is the right place for you, even if it's not here, because that's better for all of us, right?
Yeah. And that is more adult, because I could think of the equivalent conversation in an adult child context, then it might be something like, you don't make the grade, kid, you're not good enough, out. Whereas an adult to adult is, telling it like it is. It doesn't seem like you fit here. It doesn't seem like you're energized by this work, right?
Yeah, and self-managing organizations that have sophisticated role design processes, like Ian Martin Group, for example, in Canada, a recruitment company, where anyone in the organization can trigger a role advice process and say, hey, I'm thinking I'd like to change my role to something like this, and gets advice from their colleagues who might say, well, have you spoken to so-and-so, and have you considered this, and have you figured how this might impact on that? So it becomes much more about granular roles and people finding their place, rather than you join the organization in this job description and that's it, you're locked in, or you have to go through some rigid, pre-designed, predetermined kind of progression path, which is a very different approach to, well, let's sense into what are the emerging needs of the organization. Where's your energy going? What's a need that matches what you need and what the organization needs? And let's see if we can create something. So I think that's also kind of interesting to see that across these different examples, a different way of looking at roles and development and career progression. Because when it's a flat organization, there's no ladder. I don't like using the word flat really, but it's flatter. And then a lot of people wonder, well, what does progression look like, or what does career development look like if suddenly, VP of this or manager or head of this is out the window? What does progression look like?
Right. Yes. And that can be confronting for people, because that's got to come from within. In that context, there is no path laid out for me by HR, right?
Yeah.
I've got to look within and decide for myself. And of course, I might confer with others, but ultimately I self-direct, right? And where I might next go in this organization.
Yeah, and the rest of society, of course, is still driven by these symbols of status. So there's also probably a grieving process of like, oh, I thought my whole career was going to be going towards being a manager or a head or a VP of this. That's no longer an option. And yet that's what the external world recognizes as success or, progress, or, am I willing to let that go? Or maybe I'm not. So it's interesting. Even if you are in a self-managing organization, you're in a bubble, because it's still so much in the minority in terms of most organizations out there, your LinkedIn profile and stuff. So it's quite a different mindset.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very different mindset, isn't it? It's a different, it's a different paradigm. I know that word gets overused, but I think it genuinely is. And I'm just noticing the crossover with complexity here. So we've had several people on the podcast who talk about complexity theory, and one of the sort of major ideas within that field is this idea of sensing into the complex system, sensing into what's emerging. And it seems to me what you're describing is organizations that are sort of better equipped at sensing into emergent needs of the employees, but then potentially customers as well. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. It reminds me of the very first self-managing organization I visited was a number of years ago, small organization in Bournemouth called Matt Black Systems.
Oh yes, yeah. In fact, I've met the CEO.
Yeah, Julian. And he and I were having a conversation, and he was describing it to me. He was saying it's a bit like applying the idea of how evolution works. That you have evolution doesn't take one species and then in a linear fashion kind of evolve it and develop it, because then if environmental circumstances change, then that species would be wiped out, and then that would be it. Evolution fires off all of these different changes and experiments, you could call them, so that all of those different things out there, some will survive, some will flourish, and some will die. But there's enough out there that there'll be mutations and evolution, and there'll be some kind of success. And I think organizations like self-managing organizations are dealing with complexity in that more sophisticated way, which is instead of one big strategy or one 5-year plan, or these more kind of rigid speculative processes, it's like, let's fire out lots of different experiments. Let's have people really with their fingers on the pulse of what's going on in the organization and be sensing and responding in lots of little micro movements. And that's how we'll succeed, especially when things like a pandemic gets thrown at you. All of these organizations I'm seeing are much more resilient. They're so much more quick to mobilize and respond to these times. And everyone has access to the finances and transparent information about everything that's going on. And everyone feels a sense of a mental ownership, a mindset of like, this is ours. Let's get together and address this, instead of some centralized team doing some kind of response to COVID and what do we need to do. Like, everyone's already on it, and they're coming up with multiple proposals all over the place, and some decision-making process is happening, and it can be really fast, which is a completely different paradigm.
Right. Yes, and I think there may be two things at play, because I think that's true that the self-managing teams may have been much better equipped to handle it. But also, I think a lot of traditional organizations are sort of being forced into a greater degree of self-management because the same structures of control just don't work or don't exist in the same way. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah. One thing that you talked about, which I think is sort of a common question or maybe misconception about self-managing teams, is the decision-making process. And there's this perception that, oh yeah, but isn't everything going to take forever when everybody has a say? And you talk about concordance decision-making in the book. Can you, just talk a little bit about how decision-making works in these organizations?
Yeah, I think I really like Samantha Slade's work on decision making, and in her book Going Horizontal, she has a sort of table that I often use when I'm doing workshops or talks about this, because I think a big myth and misconception, like you say, is that people assume, well, if we're not making decisions in the traditional way, in a self-managed organization, everyone has to decide everything and it has to be consensus, and that's going to be slow and tedious. But the reality is that there is a whole suite of different decision-making processes. And one of the really important tasks when you decide that you want to work in this way, or even just in a more decentralized way, is decide how we're going to decide. And step one of that is realizing that there are lots of different ways to make decisions. And before, we were making them unconsciously. We were automatically defaulting to the one or two methods that we know. And part of moving to this way of working is exploring the different options of decision making, like the advice process, or like consent-based decision making, or like concordance. And all of these are very different and require practice, and they feel weird at first, but they're ways of making decisions that aren't just consensus, and at the same time, they're not just, top-down autocratic.
Yeah. Well, could you give us the highlight of each of those? Because I think there will be people interested in just how does this actually work then? So maybe that just gives people some concrete examples of how it can work.
Yeah, sure. So the first is, in traditional organizations, you could call it autocratic, I guess, where typically a manager makes the decision. And in self-managing organizations, it's not that this is now bad and we must never do that. That's also, I think, a misconception. But if you have real clarity over what everyone's roles are, then I can take a role-based decision, which might be that the whole team has decided that when it comes to a finance decision in this particular realm, I can make a decision on that, and I don't need to get input from anyone else because that's my role, and I have the relevant expertise and experience and authority to do that. So we can all agree that, but the difference is we all consent to doing that, as opposed to me assuming that I have that authority.
Right. So kind of death to the autocrat, long live the autocrat, but we'll decide who gets to be autocratic.
Exactly, yeah. So it's Matt Perez, who's part of this Mexican self-managed company called Nearsoft, talks about moving from a fiat hierarchy to a hierarchy that's been decided, that we've all agreed on. So it's not that hierarchy disappears, it's more that we end up with dynamic hierarchies and leadership emerges depending on the problem that's being faced. So autocratic decisions become role-based decisions. Then I mentioned the advice process. So this is one that's famous because of Frederick Laloux's book, Reinventing Organizations. But it was AES, I think, that first developed it. But the idea is very simple. And again, the decision-making authority ultimately lies with me, the person that initiates the decision-making process. But the idea is that I get advice from anyone who has relevant expertise and experience, and anyone who's affected by the decision. So if it's a really big decision that's going to affect lots of people, then it makes sense that I get more advice from more people compared to if it's a decision that's only going to affect a handful of people. And after having received and sought out all of that advice, I then decide if I go ahead or not. So a lot of people get nervous when they hear that because they think, well, what if the person makes a stupid decision, even having got all of that advice? Well, then everyone's going to learn, right? That person's going to learn, oh, that decision didn't go well if it is a stupid decision. And their peers are going to be a little bit more wary of that person the next time they initiate an advice process. But usually that doesn't happen. People are pretty clever and people don't want to make stupid decisions. So that's the advice process. And like I said, Ian Martin Group uses it for just about everything. So role advice process, they have a compensation advice process. So once a quarter, someone can say, I'd like to change my salary. This is my case. This is why I think I should do that. And then they go and talk to other people. And then someone might say, well, actually, have you spoken to so-and-so who's putting together the budget? Because there's some numbers that are changing, I think, that might affect your proposal. Oh, great. I didn't know that. I'll go and talk to them. So that's the advice process. Then I mentioned consent-based decision-making. So this is perhaps best known from sociocracy or holocracy, which has different versions of consent-based decision-making. But the general gist is that rather than consensus, i.e. we all like this decision or agree with this decision, it's consent. So in holocracy, it's, I can consent to something if I agree that it doesn't move us backwards or harm us. So in that case, you kind of expand the range of what's tolerable in a group in terms of decision making. Whereas if I ask a question like, who agrees with this decision? It's much more tricky and you'll have people who hesitate. Whereas if I say, does anyone object to this decision? Does anyone think this decision harms us or moves us backwards? And then it's easier for people to say, well, no, actually. And then the decision goes ahead. So it makes it a lot quicker for people to make decisions and move forward and try things and experiment and learn. So there are some different consent-based decision-making processes like integrative decision-making or generative decision-making. But that's kind of the essence. And then finally, concordance, which is a version of consensus, you could say. But the difference with concordance, which comes from Will Schutz's work, is that whereas consensus tends to be intellectual, here's the decision, do people agree? And then if not everyone agrees, then we don't go ahead. Or if everyone agrees, then we do go ahead. But concordance is a much more embodied human emotional process where there's much more space for the group to listen for and share how people really feel about that decision. So concord literally means with heart. So do I wholeheartedly agree with this? And even if I can't intellectually say a reason why I don't, that is honoured and listened to by the group. So the group only makes a decision if everyone can wholeheartedly say, yes, with my whole heart, I agree with this decision or I consent to it. And you wouldn't want to use this decision-making process for every decision because it would take a long time and it wouldn't be necessary. So this is the idea with, choose, agree together, decide how you're going to decide. For these decisions, role-based decision-making is fine and fast and effective. But for these decisions, we want everyone on board. We want everyone's whole heart and minds behind this decision. So for these decisions, we'll use concordance, recognizing that that's going to take a bit longer, but in the long run, that's going to be important because we need people on board with that. And it's going to be a better decision if we do that.
Right. Yes, which is another, I think, emerging theme in, I suppose, this whatever is happening to the world right now in terms of how we work is this idea of body, heart, embodied, I suppose, experiences in the workplace and using our bodies as a guide to, what should happen next, and as a sense-making organ in and of itself, right? It's respecting that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also moving away from, we tend to work in binaries too. Like, is it decision A or decision B? Whereas when you have a process like concordance, you might actually realize maybe it's neither. If we actually put those aside for a moment, what is the need here actually? What is something that we could all live with that feels good and positive and possible? And then suddenly you might have a C that you would not have got to if you'd only said, right, decision A or decision B, let's have a vote or let's, put it to a consensus decision. And you won't get that level of rigor or innovation or perspective if you kind of rush it and if you only do a kind of head arbitrary sort of decision.
Right. Yes, it's. I'm just pausing because I recognize that this. I mean, it's almost like one thing to talk about. Okay, we're going to distribute authority, and that's sort of hard terms that people can relate to. But it's almost like there's another sort of level of depth in what we're describing here, which almost I can feel a bit of a discomfort talking about, and I'm guessing is almost another frontier there in terms of sort of bringing, when we talk about whole human or whole person to work, we mean heart, we mean body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is what Frederick Laloux calls growth pain. That it is, you asked me about the tough training earlier and was it painful? And I think the reality is to move to this way of working is painful. Like learning any new skill that's hard, it's painful. There's a level of discomfort, the groan zone, right? When you go from, learning a new language, it takes time to become bilingual. As I'm learning with my Spanish at the moment. So there is that kind of, you have to sit in the fire of that discomfort. And a lot of people, don't want to do that. We're not really wired to do that as humans. We like to avoid pain and we like to go for shortcuts. But if we do really want to unlock new ways of working and being together that are more human, that are more creative, that are more agile, I think this is really the frontier, this is, if we can recognize that this is tough, like decision making, for example. Once you really get into it, you realize, oh, there's this whole other suite of skills and practices and ways of being that we didn't realize were out there that we now need to learn. It's not just a case of stop doing that and now do this. And so I think that's really the task that we're faced with. And I think if we're up for it, there's kind of gold on the other side of it. But it's not easy. That's what everyone says that I speak to in these organizations. It's tough, it's painful, but it's really, really rewarding.
Right. Yeah. And I hear the same in terms of sort of the agile community, is that so many agile transformations stall or get somewhere, one step forward, two steps back. And I think it's the same thing because it is so exposing and it is painful for people to make this transition sometimes. I think that's a very good point. And in fact, there's an example in the book of someone within Tough who goes and takes a 9-to-5 job where everything's prescribed. It's almost the way I read it. It's like as a break from it.
Yeah.
And then comes back to Karin a year later and says, okay, I'm up for it again, right? I can take it. I'm ready to kind of grow again almost.
Yeah.
No, I can see that. And it also relates to this idea of people being passionate about their work. I mean, we had John Hagel was my last guest, and he talks a lot about, he makes this quite bold claim that actually the organizations and the individuals, only those who are passionate, are going to survive this sort of hyper competitive world that we're moving into. Because if I'm competing as an accountant, and I'm passionate about accounting, but the person next to me is not passionate, I'm going to be able to go through that pain to grow, to become, the best accountant I can be. Whereas this person, to the left or right of me isn't in the same way. And so organizations that harness the sort of power of passion will be the ones that thrive. And those that sort of ignore people's passions or don't seek to maximize them or maximize the potential of them aren't going to do so well. And this seems to relate to this idea. You can't really do that unless you're creating self-managing organizations.
Yeah, or I think another term that I quite like is ambidextrous organizations. So especially if you're a large organization, it's probably unrealistic to think that, anytime soon, large organizations are going to move towards self-management. But what you might end up with is like what Danfoss is doing, where they have certain departments or arms of the organization that are self-managing, and they tend to be the ones that are working in research and development or innovation. And so when you have, younger people joining the company, they don't want to join the company and go into like a bloated bureaucratic department. They're more likely going to want to join one of those departments where there's a lot more autonomy and they can sort of really find their place and sense what's needed. And there will also be departments in the organization that are more traditionally structured, and that's fine and that works for that particular context. So I think that's an interesting idea. And also I was thinking as you were talking about, I'm reading Gary Hamel's new book, Humanocracy.
Okay,
and he was writing about how in the past, meaningful work was reserved only for like the artisans and the kind of crafts people, the creative people, whereas now we're in a stage of human civilization where a lot of people are now able to and wanting to find work that's more meaningful. It's not just the artisans, but everyone that's joining the, especially younger generations that are saying, hey, I don't want to just do a 9 to 5. I want to do a job that's purposeful and meaningful and maybe aligns with my values. So we're in an interesting point, I think, where it's not just reserved for a few, this idea of meaningful, purposeful work. So there's a great opportunity, I think, to really unlock that in people. And it can be any kind of role, that I've seen amazing industrial companies, factories, where people on the front line, as soon as they're given permission and authority to make decisions, to actually influence things, to challenge things, to question things, they've got tons of ideas that were just there all the time and blocked by the structure of the company. And so you release all of this creative energy and intelligence and creativity. So I think it's really exciting to think about the potential of organizations now that, it doesn't have to be this soulless, I go to the office and I turn my brain and my heart off, but it can be something more.
Right. And the great example of this, I think it even may have been Lelou's book of the guy who's a metal worker, a sheet metal worker at Favi, I think is the French, right, sort of auto parts manufacturer, who also would get on the phone to a trader in New York to spot buy the metal they needed for the factory, right? And that just, to me, encapsulated that idea of you sort of lift the lid and you allow people to find where their talents lie. You get people are way more capable than we might expect, right? And
then their job description allows for, right? Like you find these in the book. Karin talks about this healthcare company, and it turned out the janitor was this amazing entrepreneurial spirit, and he was great at doing deals and cost saving and doing all this kind of stuff, and was just waiting for the opportunity to use those talents. So I think, when we can find people to know this is your job, and I remember that when I was an employee, I was a terrible employee. I was very rebellious and restless, and I was so frustrated. Like, well, yes, my job description is this, but I want to contribute that, and I'm creative, and let me do this. And it was constantly kind of battered away like, no, this is not your domain. And it's just such a waste.
Right. And I guess that's a bit of so it's been a while since you've had a proper job.
Yeah, I don't think I could go back now.
Yeah. Fantastic. The other question here that well, I don't know if it's a question, just it's something that seemed to emerge from this book, is that two things really. This only really works for companies in terms of for the whole organization, where the CEO and the board are really committed, 100% committed to have this happen. And as soon as you take that person, or often when you take that individual away, the culture sort of reverts back to something more traditional. So the question is that true? And if so, how do you create sustaining self-managed organizations, or does it always need the this sort of ultimate leader to hold it all together?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big question that I am continually exploring, and I think there are different perspectives on it. I'm thinking about the example of Hire in China, which is a huge self-managing organization. And I was asking someone recently about Zhang Ruimin, the CEO there, if he left, because he's been the vision holder of this evolution of the company for decades now, what would happen if he left? And people in Hire will tell you that the system is the system that's been built around his vision is strong enough now and robust enough through the decades of kind of experimenting that if he left, it wouldn't crumble, that someone else from within would take his place and would continue that vision. So I think my sense is that it's important to recognize, I really like the work of Peter Koenig and his source theory. I think it's quite a useful lens for looking at this, which is that he sees that there is a person who embodies this role of source, which means they hold the space for a particular vision to emerge. And if that person leaves, it will sort of fall away unless that person very consciously hands over the source, that role, to someone else who is also aligned with and understands and connects with that vision. And they might do it in a different way, but will sort of continue to steward the essence of that. So I think a lot of examples of where it's sort of unraveled, and it's sad how quickly it happens. There's quite a few cases of when the CEO or the founder leaves, how quickly it snaps back to kind of top down. So I think unless you're very intentional about recognizing, number one, the role that that person plays and trying to almost like model what is it that they do, how is it that they're holding that role, so that we can sort of understand it and codify it so it's not such a mystery, but also building systems and structures and processes and practices around it that we can all continue to nurture and be responsible for, so that if that person did leave or disappear suddenly, there's enough kind of scaffolding there that it wouldn't suddenly unravel. And part of this, I think, is also governance and ownership, that we need to reinvent those aspects, I think, so that you don't have a board that comes in, swoops in when there are financial troubles and reverts it back to the old way, but you have some mechanisms in place that protect this way of working as well. So I think, it's complicated.
Complicated. And as you speak, I wonder if it's almost too early in the movement for us to have good answers around it, right? We seem to have lots of examples of where people have intuitively or figured out a way to have it work, and then they leave and it crumbles. But so maybe it's just the sort of next phase of this inquiry is how do we create sustaining self-managing organizations? Maybe we've answered the question of how do we create them. It's then how do we create sustaining ones?
I think so. I think we need to study what are the principles in it, and it will be unique for every organization and every individual, but what are some of the commonalities and what are some of the qualities that this person embodies when they're holding that role, so that we can demystify it and be much more conscious in choosing their successor, for example. And also what are the systems that we can create around that vision that are kind of anti-fragile enough that if someone does try to poke or break or disrupt, that the system will respond and kind of, antibodies will push out the the kind of foreign invasion.
Yeah, I can't remember, one of the big medical institutions in the States that have gone a long way with this had something like that, where they had a sort of senior VP move in to become, I think, the CEO, and wanted to tried to push it back down to a more compartment and got pushed out. So yes, it is an interesting question. I think there's something for mergers for me when I read these stories is one quality of these leaders, and I think it comes through in Karin in the book, is this desire to keep working on myself, right? Yeah. Because it's almost like it's a continual letting go of, right? I'm letting go of my attachment to controlling this outcome or being this person or playing this role. It's like this constant inquiry of, where am I doing this thing that's having an impact that isn't conducive to self-management? And then how can I not be that or unwind that? And so that seems to be at the core of somebody who's holding space.
Yeah. And I think a big insight for me that I treasure a lot was from Mickey Cashtan when I spoke to her on my podcast. And she talked about like an inner shift that needs to happen in all of us and that it needs to happen from both directions. So if you are a leader or a manager, or you have been a leader or manager, that, as you say, I have to start to sense into like, what's my version of being a dictator, for example? You know, even in any small way, when do I not listen? When do I interrupt? When do I butt in? And it has to happen the other way too. So I think in terms of sustainability, we need to support people who haven't historically had power, authority, to step up. That is really a challenge when you have a learned helplessness in a way, when you're used to being passive and deferring decision making and waiting for problems to get solved, or, you know, waiting for your performance appraisal or whatever, you know. To unlearn that is really tough, and we have to practice. You know, so many people say to me like, oh, Lisa, we declared self-management, but people aren't stepping up. Like, people aren't taking initiative. Like, what's the big deal? Like, do people just need to be told what to do? And I say that it takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes compassion to kind of support people along this journey, because we all start at different places. And I think if you can really help people to shift from, you know, parent to child and child to parent into this adult to adult dynamic, my hope is that then, you know, even if this person that's holding the role of source, if they did leave, that you, because it requires courage from everyone else in the organization to speak up. If, you know, the new VP comes in, you want people to say, hey, that's not how we do things here. That's not our
You're
culture.
treating me like a child, and I'm an adult, and I demand to be treated
and to
like an
do
adult.
that in a way that's like, you know, that comes from conviction and proposals and really standing for the culture. And you also need people who are in leadership roles to listen. So it has to go both ways. And I think I think this is really like the area, as you say, that needs more work and more understanding and research and development, is like, what are these skills, these qualities, these ways of being for all of us at different levels to engage with, that are going to help make this way of working sustainable and resilient and, you know, scalable and all of those good things.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. It just reminded me, as you're talking in the book, there's I think one of the administrators in Tough keeps having to ask Karin, can I have some time off this week?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's been 5 years. You don't have to ask me whether you want any time off.
Yeah. But it's so, you know, it reminds me of Shawshank Redemption as well, when they leave prison and they have to ask for permission to go to the toilet when he's working in the grocery store, because we're just so conditioned. So it really takes time to unlearn these things.
So maybe that's part of the sustainability is the CEO around long enough for a sort of critical mass of the people within the organization to have grown out of those internalized shackles, and you grow out of a shackle, or have cast off those internalized shackles, such that they can be the antibodies, you know, should a new senior leader try and revert things. And I wonder if that's also true in the sort of agile space, for people who are listening to this from an agile context, is does the transformation sort of hold this, you know, do people hold the space of the transformation for long enough that you've tipped enough people over into this, you know, let's call it adult to adult style of working, such that they can then be a stand for it themselves, you know, without needing to sort of lean on the stand of the senior leader.
So there's this example that I really like, that some colleagues and I were talking about, based on Netflix, and they have this protocol called the Chaos Monkey, which basically knocks out at random a server in Netflix, in their sort of system, their network of servers, to test if there's, you know, as a kind of anti-fragility test, to see are there any, you know, weaknesses in the system. And I think it would be really interesting to test that with a self-managing organization, or an organization where the CEO or the founder is holding this role, and to test whether this way of being, this way of working has really disseminated, has been distributed across the whole organization, or whether it's really only one person that's holding that 100%. And if they go, the whole thing collapses. And sometimes it's not the CEO or founder, sometimes it's someone else. There might be someone in a project that's kind of hoarding responsibility, or, or doing substantially more work than is visible, that people don't realize until they go off sick, or, so these things happen, I think, and can often be a really useful opportunity to review weaknesses in the system, or to see, like, is there a way that we can make this foundation, this kind of scaffolding even stronger, so that taking away one piece is not going to make the whole tower collapse. So I think it'd be cool to test that somehow.
Petition Joss to go traveling for 6 months.
Yeah, exactly. I think in the case of Buurtzorg, my sense is that the culture there is really strong. And if Josteblok did disappear or leave, I think having met a couple of the nurses there, there's enough legacy there and enough structure and peer support that it would hold, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I've no great experience of the culture, but that would make sense. That they've built up they seem to have built up, I suppose, because of the scale of it as well. They must have an awful lot of people now within that organization who are now used to that way of working. I think the other point,
they wouldn't go back either. I think so many of them came from large healthcare organizations before that were so frustrating that they just wouldn't tolerate it. I think if someone came in and said, right, we're going to go back to targets and centralized coordination, people would be like up in arms.
Yeah. I think the other thing that comes to mind, and I had Amy Emson on the podcast, and when she talks about psychological safety, she talks about this asymmetry of the risk reward when speaking up. So if I keep my mouth shut, I'm instantly rewarded because there's no risk to my personal psychological safety. So that's the payoff for me keeping quiet. But if I speak up, there's an instant risk that I might be humiliated or shouted down. So there's an instant risk of a negative outcome. My positive outcome is only going to be, if I have it at all, will only come later. Once it's whatever it is I've proposed has been discussed and there's a positive outcome to it. So the payoff for speaking up is delayed and is not as immediate. So that's why we have this asymmetry, right, of reward of staying quiet versus speaking up. And I think about that in these cultures, right? And that must contribute to the fragility, because as soon as I get a manager in who's going to say, no, get back in your box, you've got to do it this way. If there isn't enough people around me who are going to push back on that, very quickly I'm going to flip back to that mode of, oh no, my payoff is going to be to keep quiet. And so I think that probably contributes to this fragility of these organizations in a sense. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think Amy Edmondson's work is really relevant to this. And she and I talked about, we both agree about this idea of working climate and how localized that is. And it can change instantly if you have a new team leader. So I think you're absolutely right that I think one of the things Karin says that I really like is that in a self-managing organization, everyone becomes a sensor for the culture, and it's everyone's job to be a co-producer of our working climate together. And if you can train that and practice that together, and if enough people kind of hold that duty together, then I think you're right. I think it does need enough people to be able to do that, so that even if someone does come in and maybe one or two people immediately think, oh, it's safer to not speak up, that there are enough people who say, no, come on, this is important. This is our culture, and this is not in line with what we agreed. Let's speak up.
Yeah. And so they have to feel that part of their role is continuing to co-create the culture. It's not just they have some function for the business. It's that they're also sort of co-custodians of the culture. Yeah, I suppose that's an important point.
And I think their rituals and micro practices can be really helpful, because we're creatures of habit. So if you, as well as the kind of macro culture, if you have, in every meeting, as we do at Tough, for example, we start every meeting with any moose heads. Does anyone have any, an elephant in the room, a little niggle with someone or something that they want to bring up and air out right here, right now? And it's always hard. It never gets easier to do it because it's uncomfortable, but it's become the way we do things. And there are enough people that will kind of carry that torch, and they will ask this question, even if some of us think like, oh, it's just a bit easier to not, and like, I'll just keep it under the carpet,
Right. Yeah. And I suppose once that's become ingrained in the culture, if I'm to come and say, oh, actually, let's just skip the moose heads for this meeting, people would be like, yeah, I guess much more quick to push back if it's become habitual, because people to some extent get a little bit addicted to their habits, don't they? So you sort of use that for positive effect. Yeah, that's interesting. So I thought I might ask that question of what do we mean by moose heads, but we've now revealed the Swedish version of elephant in the room.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Is that every time you get together you ask that question?
Yeah. And sometimes, there was a meeting recently where we realized it hadn't happened for a couple of meetings, and then someone did bring up a moose head, and we all, because this is the other thing as well, is like positive reinforcement, especially if you're a leader or anyone who has social capital influence. Like you say, this asymmetry of the risk of speaking up, it's so important to appreciate and acknowledge when people do it, to say like, oh, thank you so much for bringing up that moose head, for reminding us that this is something we do that's really important, and for daring to, be uncomfortable and do that and speak up and be difficult and challenge something. Like, we really appreciate that, and making that, so explicit, because I think we often don't do that. And I think that's really key to reinforcing these rituals and to building and strengthening that this is the way we do things. This is our culture.
Yeah. And I guess just an important illustration of how these cultures aren't fluffy. Right?
Yeah, exactly. I think
they're tough. She called it tough training for a reason.
Yeah. Karin she's really a champion of that, and we all are at Tough, even though some of us are more inclined towards the fluffy, like me. But I recognize that, it's like the radical candor feedback framework, and in Amy Edmondson's work as well, she talks about this of having, it's not just about psychological safety, but also about accountability. And without that, you end up in the comfort zone, and ultimately that breeds resentment, because people, become lax with deadlines, or you don't know how to give each other feedback because you don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. So it is really this paradox, this marriage of tough and empathetic, kind of challenging and supporting, that I think takes a lot of practice, and is another misconception of self-managing organizations. Oh, is it just everyone sitting around hugging and, playing ping pong or whatever? No, actually, these companies, when you see a meeting in a really effective self-managing team or organization, people are having tough, difficult, adult-to-adult conversations with care, but directness and frankness. And that, I think, is the key, actually.
Right. And it reminds me of another guest, Raj Sisodia, who wrote The Healing Organization. And he starts, I think it's the first chapter in his book, he talks about this importance of the marriage of feminine and masculine energy. And that's important for each of us as individuals to nurture and develop our healthy masculine and feminine sides, but just as important in an organization, right? And almost defines a healing organization, one that's embodied both.
Yeah, definitely.
See what you're talking about here.
Yeah, I think that's happening. I think in some ways, if you take like holocracy, in some ways you could describe that as quite a masculine framework. And I think it's really interesting to see how Brian Robertson and Holocracy One are encouraging people to complement it with other, I think he also calls them apps, actually, like things like non-violent communication, for example, which you could say are the more feminine pieces, because I think it takes both. So I think it's interesting to see how that's unfolding as well, like this mix of masculine and feminine, and sort of the hard and the soft.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, well, maybe that's a good motif to end this on. As a male talking to a female and having had a wonderful conversation. Good. Well, thank you, Lisa. Again, for people watching, here's the book, and for people listening, we'll put a link. Moose Heads on the Table. Karin Tenelius.
Yeah.
Tenelius. There we are. And Lisa Gill. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And I hope. I look forward to the next collection of stories.
Yeah. Well, perhaps the next book is a collection of the podcast stories. So I'm collecting lots of those.
Yeah, great idea. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again. It's been great.
Thank you very much.